Welcome back. The story I'm going to tell you is completely true. My cousins have been asking me to tell this particular story, and here it is. When I was 11 years old, my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer. By the time they diagnosed him, it was so advanced, treatment was not an option. The arrangement my family decided on was that he would stay in the home my mother and her sister lived in, and the family would take turns caring for him. The children of the parents who cared for my grandfather overnight would stay at one of the uncles' houses who lived close by to where my grandfather was staying. The house the children would stay was in the middle of about 20 acres of onion fields. They would stay there with the designated adult family member to watch the children. My older brother and I would sleep there every night in the last weeks of my grandfather's illness, so that we would not get in my mother's way. The house we stayed at in the middle of the fields was under construction. The bathroom had literally no roof. It was like a regular bathroom. It had a sink, a toilet, and a bathtub. The bathroom was a step lower than the entire house. It had no windows, and on the other side of the bathroom there were very tall plants that looked just like bamboo, but it is called arunda weeds in the desert. They towered over and even hung into the bathroom. It was kind of beautiful during the day, but so creepy at night, especially since it was the adult habit to leave the door open at night to let in the fresh air. The only way to access the bathroom was through the living room. The living room had a bed, and the house had only one finished bedroom at this time. We slept on the floor with blankets and sleeping bags, and the adults watching us would sleep in the bed. There was a master bedroom, but no one slept in that room, so that the uncle and his wife who lived there could have a bed to rest in between taking care of my grandfather and working. We all were outdoor kids, always exploring, and this day is the day I remember the most, as it was the day unnatural things began to happen, things we had never before experienced in this place. My aunt and uncle let us know they were going to go see my grandfather, and would be gone for about 2 hours. At this time there was no other adult in the house, and it was only 3 of us children. My brother was 12 years old. My cousin, we will call him C, was 10 years old, and his sister S was 7 years old, and of course me, 11 years old. As soon as my uncle's car turned off the long dirt road onto the main road, a half a mile away from the house, we began to walk to the huge bar next door. It was about 300 feet away from the house. This was against the house rules, but we had always talked about the place several times and had decided if we could ever get away with looking in there, we would. We walked to the empty stables, and before we opened the door of the barn, a small building, about 10 by 10 feet, caught my eye. It looked like a small white storage. I went around it until I found a door. My little cousin S, laughing nervously, came up to the door behind me. I opened it, and what I found inside scared the life out of me. Inside this room, there were hooks. Not just hanging on the walls, but a big, sharp hook hanging in the middle of the room, with one small window on the upper back part of the wall. The walls were shiny, like plastic, and the floor had a center drain. It was hot and humid inside. It smelled of bleach. I took a small breath and held it, when suddenly S let out a loud scream in horror right behind me. I turned around and quickly covered her mouth, and now I had began to laugh. I told her, laughing, "Shut up, stupid. It's a room where they cut up meats to freeze or to cook." I knew she understood what I was explaining. Her father had killed pigs and cows. Outdoors were carnitas for family weddings and quinceañeras. She laughed and said,
I thought it was to kill people.
And I closed the door and began to walk to the barn, when suddenly I froze as I realized I had seen something that, until that second, did not make any sense to me. I turned around and went back to take a closer look at those pieces of metal I had seen. I opened the door and saw them. I could not make out what they were, but they creeped me out. They looked like prison inmate shackles I had seen on TV. I shocked it off to them being some sort of meat tool, but the thought that they could be used on a person crossed my mind. I walked behind S now, and I was not going to mention it to her. She was too young and I didn't want to scare her. I went to the barn and my cousins mentioned we should hurry up if we didn't want to get caught by his parents. We played in the big empty barn, and after running around and exploring, we ended up on the side of the barn, where there was a small room with a low window. Inside the small room there was what seemed to be a wooden queen-size bed. No sheets, no furniture, just an ugly, dirty old mattress. The only thing other than the bed in that room was more metal tools hanging over the footboard of the bed. Those round, questionable tools. No one else seemed to care or question the room. We played for about an hour in the empty barn, and suddenly the boys yelled, "Let's go back already, so we don't get caught, okay?" And they began to run back to the house laughing. I walked slowly with S, checking the dirt road, making sure her parents had not yet come home. As we walked, I began to think someone could use those shackle-looking things to torture and dismember people in that clean room. I took one last look back at the clean room with the hooks. There was a water hose on the side. I imagined all they had to do was wash everything down the drain and feed the remainder to pigs. I told us never to go there alone or get close to that property, even when the owners are there. S was also looking back, trying to see what I was looking at, as we kept slowly walking in the direction of the house. When we turned forward to cross the dirt road and almost walked into a tall man holding a long stick. We stopped inches away from him and stepped back terrified. We had never seen anyone drive down this dirt road other than family and friends, let alone a man walking there in the middle of nowhere. He looked at both of us and then looked at the barn we had come from. I now looked at this man up and down. He was clearly a native man with a long walking stick. The stick had feathers, beads, and rattlesnake rattlers at the top of his stick. He was maybe in his 40s and had long, straight black hair. He wore jeans, sandals, and a thin, colorful, button-up long-sleeve shirt. S, who only spoke broken English at the time, began to talk to him in Spanish. He interrupted in a soft voice.
"I speak English."
He did not take his eyes off the barn when he spoke. We were about to walk away from him and make a run for the house. I became afraid. We could no longer see the boys. They had gone in the house and not waited for us. S reached for my hand and leaned in close to me, not taking her eyes off the man. I looked down at her and was about to signal with my eyes for her to run when the man spoke again.
"Don't go over there again, eh?"
He looked at us briefly to see if we understood English. We both nodded up and down. In those seconds that felt like hours, I was terrified. He then looked back at the barn. I thought he was the owner of the land, or a caretaker, or a relative. I personally had not met the owner. I didn't know what he looked like. He then told us,
"That property around that barn is bad. Not for children."
I answered quickly, "Yes, sir. We won't ever go there again. We're sorry." He looked at me once again and then looked at the ground and said,
Your ancestors are strong inside you. That is good. Always call on them for things like that.
He pointed his stick towards the barn without looking over that way. How did he know I come from Indian descent? I'd always suspected it. I'm pretty sure my grandmother is of Tarahumara native descent from Mexico. My cousin's skin is a brown honey color with black hair. But I look like my Spaniard side of the family. I have dirty blonde hair and milky white skin. And this man, he was now looking at me. When I made eye contact, he looked away. And without saying goodbye, he walked up to the edge of the barn's property. S and I walked fast to the house, looking back at him to see what he was doing. I was no longer scared of him. He seemed worried. And now, I needed to know what he was doing. It was interesting how he put his hands up, palm facing the barn. And he would lift his stick, then stab it in the hard, dry ground. S and I then sat outside of the house on an old, thick tree trunk, looking at him as he walked and occasionally looked into the property, and he nodded in disapproval. We watched him until he made his way to the end of the dirt road and crossed the main road. We went inside and told the boys. A man told us not to go to that property anymore. They mentioned they had seen him a few days ago, that he walked the long dirt road, and that he had told them to stay away from a specific tree on the onion field property. That bad things had been done on that tree, and it was haunted. We did not tell our aunt and uncle about the man when they got home, as we were not allowed over there in the first place. We the children went outside, and as the sun had set, we began to play on the edge of the recently watered onion fields, when suddenly we heard and felt a rumbling in the ground that became louder as we realized it was coming in the direction of the barn. It was low at first, but as it got louder, it became a loud metal scrape that turned into what sounded like a slow rise of voices crying. It was like a lot of different grown-ups and children crying. One man sounded sad, and we could not understand what he was saying. It was not English or Spanish, and it sounded like he was begging, praying as he cried. I stared at the dark barn. Not one light on. It was almost pitch black in that direction. There was no moon this night, and the sun was setting. We ran inside and told my uncle, who immediately came outside to see what we were all talking about. Only now it was quiet. Eerily quiet. And even when he did not hear what we had just heard, he rushed us in the house and said for us not to go outside anymore. We asked why he was upset and why he did that. And he said it was almost too quiet. He said that since he moved there, it had not been that quiet on a watering day. That there was always bugs and birds making noises at sundown. He changed the conversation and left us all confused. After dinner, we settled in to watch TV. A few cars drove up and a large amount of cousins began to walk in the house, with sleeping bags and blankets to spend the night. They explained to us that grandfather had taken a turn for the worst, and for the next couple of nights we would all be sleeping together in this house, so that the adults could watch over our grandfather. This meant we had to take care of each other now, make sure that everyone ate, and was safe when outdoors. After my aunt and uncle left, another uncle stayed with us, only he was almost immediately overwhelmed with the amount of children that were in the house. He asked if we wanted to play outside. We jumped at the opportunity. We loved to play outside at night. We had forgotten all about the crying in the barn. This was until we stepped outside. There was about 15 of us then. When I remembered, I immediately looked over at the barn, and my cousin C went over to me and said,
"Let's not tell anybody about that, because then we have to go inside. My dad's not here anyway."
I agreed, and off we went to play. We played for literally hours outside. The field that surrounded the house for miles was freshly watered. It made the dirt very muddy, so we tried to stay away from the edges. There was a center clearing right in front of the house where we liked to play. We made a fire to keep the center of the clearing bright and lit up for all the little ones to play around. And we played hide-and-go-seek, tag, and other games. Suddenly, one of my cousins, we will call her V. She was 7 years old at this time. V began to cry and say she lost one of her shoes in the mud. The older kids became upset at her. She had gotten too close to the onion fields where we did not allow them to go this late at night, and now she lost her shoe. We scolded her and told her that's what she got for not listening. She cried even louder. It was very dark, and we built a main fire and a few torches with plastic. Very dangerous, I know now. Most of us got mild burns from the dripping hot plastic. We all took our torches to go to look for the shoe. We hated going in the mud at night. Rattlesnakes are very common in this area. A few of the older cousins took our shoes off and went looking for the shoe in the edge of the mud. She continued to cry, both because she lost her shoe and because us older cousins had scolded her. Finally, someone found her shoe and yelled out from excitement, and then ran to the water hose to wash off the muddy shoe. We all went to the water hose to wash our feet off, when we hear V continue to cry. A few of us yelled at her direction to stop crying, how we had found her shoe and we were washing it off. We told her she was not going to get in trouble, and that her shoe is fine. As I washed my muddy feet, immediately she answered behind us in a very low, squeaky voice,
"It's not me."
We turned off the water and looked in the direction of the cry. It was in the direction where we found the shoe. We turned around and counted heads by siblings, and we were all there, close to the water hose. Suddenly the house door flung open and my uncle asked,
"Who's crying? Who's hurt?"
We all began to walk inside the house now. He stood out the door looking out. Us older cousins looked over his shoulder. I told him, "It's not one of us. We're all inside now." He looked at all the children inside the kitchen out directly behind him. He was upset and said,
"We left one outside."
I could hear the crying coming closer now. It sounded exactly like V. It was mimicking V. The little ones began to cry, and the older ones told them to go further in the house, to the living room. I could see my uncle sliding his shoes on, getting ready to step out. We began to beg him not to go. "We're all here. Count us, don't go. Don't leave us alone." It was a deep emotional cry that slowly turned from a little girl's cry to a grown woman's cry. My cousins and older brother began to say,
"It's the Llorona. This canal water is from the river."
The Llorona is an old story our parents used to tell us, related to the Rio Grande, the river that runs through Denver, New Mexico, and Texas. The story of La Llorona was that a devastated woman who was abandoned by her husband to be with a younger woman, in turn drowned her 2 children in the river, and when she realized what she had done, she ran after the children's floating bodies, only to fall and tangle her long dark hair in the wood debris and drown. My mother told us her spirit followed the river water, looking for her children and crying out loud. My mother told us never to be out after dark, or she may mistaken us for one of her children and take us. My uncle, still standing at the door, looked at all of us and then stared at me. We could hear the cries not 50 feet away from the front door. I could not see anything over his shoulder, but it now sounded like a woman crying, a grown woman. Suddenly he slammed the door and locked it. That night, we all laid down in the living room floor as planned. No one wanted to sleep close to the bathroom door except for my cousin. We will call her Jay. Jay was not familiar with this house, and nobody told her not to sleep close to the bathroom door. She did not know that the bathroom door was left open at night for air to circulate. Jay never played with us or hanged out with us. She had been inside all day reading. She was a bit of a nerd. Actually, I admit, we let her pick that spot so that we didn't end up at the end of the sleeping lane. She was older. We figured she should be there, because my uncle left the bathroom door open. I remember staying awake for most of the night, afraid that if my uncle fell asleep, the thing would make its way in the house and take one of us, specifically the one it was mimicking. I expected to hear the woman crying or to see her crawl out of the bathroom since there was no roof. Finally, I fell asleep only to wake up to crying in the room. Not loud as before, a low, emotional cry. I opened my eyes to find a woman sitting on the floor next to us, crying, with her hands to her face. Her long black hair covering most of her back. I am about to freak out when I see the girl next to her sit up and hug her and ask,
Jay, why are you crying?
As several of the cousins begin to sit up in the dark and ask, why is she crying? She says in her soft voice, Papa Mun just passed away. Papa Mun was our grandfather. We asked her why she thought that, and before she could explain, someone was at the front door. And the uncle taking care of us got up out of bed and went to the door. He comes back and looks at Jay confused, and he tells us all to gather our things, that our grandfather had just passed away. All the cousins sat there quiet for a few seconds, looking at Jay, and we all began to cry and hug each other. He had stopped by to say goodbye to his grandbabies, and one of them heard him.